This is Dan Schneider on this Dan Schneider video interview. The subject is the deep roots of war theory. I have Michael Spaggett who's going to be talking about it, and we will talk about that when we return. Michael Spaggett is my guest. He will be talking about what is known as the deep roots of war theory and his opinions on it. I came upon this topic, well, I've known about it for a few years, but I came upon it due to an email exchange online represented of many websites between Steven Pinker and John Horgan, a science researcher, and I thought it would be an interesting topic for discussion. Today I will be talking with Michael Spaggett, and tomorrow I'll actually be talking with someone else, a fellow named Richard Wrangham, who originally I wanted to have the two of them together, but Wrangham got back to me late, and he also wants to talk about some of his ideas in his book, so I decided to keep them separate. So it'll be a paired set. This is the first of the two. So Michael, welcome. If you could give a couple of minutes, take a couple of minutes and tell us a little bit about yourself, what you've written, and your interest in this theory of war.
Okay, yeah, thank you. I'm really pleased to be on here, Dan. Thank you for inviting me. Well, I guess I've got something of a checkered academic history. So if we go way back, I actually did a PhD in economics, with my interest being in the Soviet economy and central planning. But shortly after I finished my PhD dissertation, the Soviet economy, or the Soviet Union, disappeared as such. And the Soviet economy, as it had been when I began studying it, disappeared. So I spent some years working on the transition from communism, but I realized that was kind of an inherently bounded, finite undertaking. I was still fairly young back then, and I was casting around for something else to do, and I ended up working on war just because I had a Colombian PhD student who wanted to write something about the Colombian War in his dissertation, and so I kind of glommed onto war, and I guess I've been doing that for more than 20 years now. And I've done a lot of different kinds of things on war, a lot about the measurement of, well, in particular, numbers of people killed in wars and disputes over such numbers. But I've also done work on, I guess, what might be called the fundamental nature of warfare, recurring patterns that seem to emerge in lots of different kinds of war, and, which I suppose got me on this show, I've written now a bit about what might be called the decline of war debate, which has been something that's been around for a while, but that got a big push forward in 2011, I believe it was, when Steven Pinker published his book, The Better Angels of Our Nature.
So if your background is in economics, did you come to war with the idea that most wars in history have been fought over resources? Because we always hear about ethnic cleansing, we hear about religious wars, but in your opinion, have most wars been about resources?
I did not. Oh, my cuckoo clock is going on.
That's fine.
I did not really enter into the war field with any such notion that it was going to primarily be about economics. And in fact, very little of my own work has been about what might be viewed as the economics of war narrowly construed, although I do teach a course at my college called The Economics of Warfare. I mean, on the question about whether most wars have been fought over economic resources, I mean, that's kind of such a big question, kind of unanswerable, but I suppose I would venture no, probably not. Certainly a number have been, and even in wars that aren't fought first and foremost over economic resources often come into play in explaining who wins in the end. Perhaps a good example being World War II, which I think was not started first and foremost for economic reasons, but the economic reasons began impinging on Nazi Germany from the get-go and played a big role in determining the outcome.
So if we're talking about war, let's just step back for a moment and talk about violence and human violence before we get to the deep roots. There are 2 points I wanted to bring out. The first one is we have to demarcate between individual violence, the propensity for individual violence, and group violence. Individual violence would be someone who's a psychopath, a Ted Bundy, who's maybe a sexual sadist. It might be someone who's, just a hitman who just likes killing. It might be just, a violent father or a mother that abuses their children. And then we have the groups, which could be organized crime, terrorist groups, state violence. So how do you separate those two things when we're talking, since we're going to be talking about the deep roots of war, how do you separate the violence of the individual from that of the group?
Yeah, I think quite a bit of human violence could be categorized as, let's say, impulsive or spur of the moment kind of violent, like a bar fight, that could escalate even to murder. So I think generally there are some various definitions of war around, but I think generally I think the main idea is that war is violence between organized groups and involving some kind of a political incompatibility. So perhaps one group trying to overthrow the state, or one state trying to take over territory from another state. And it's potentially very different from individual level violence, and the reasons for it can be quite different. I do think a lot of individual violence, as I started this comment with, is kind of impulsive, or people just losing control. Maybe if they think back on it a day or two later, they might think, that was kind of crazy. I wish I hadn't done that. Whereas with states, in some states may also sometimes act impulsively like individual humans, but I think usually when there's war, there's a bit more of a chance to think and at least potentially head it off.
Now, there was also levels within group violence. For example, when I was a kid, I was in a teenage gang, and oftentimes we would get into fights with other gangs because one guy from one group insulted another guy from another group. So it wasn't really over resources. It wasn't over politics. Right. It wasn't over religion or sex or whatnot. It was just two guys basically dick waving.
Yeah. Respect, something like that. Yeah.
So is that something that's limited to smaller groups, do you think? Like you can look at that as more tribalistic, and does that sort of get watered down as you go higher up the hierarchy in terms of numbers, tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands to millions of people involved?
Well, I think that it probably does get watered down without necessarily disappearing entirely. To just reach for a recent example, or at least the one that was in the news recently, the U.S. response after the 9/11 attacks. And I think that there was, after the 9/11 attacks, a real palpable sense in the U.S. that there needed to be some kind of a response, and it probably needed to be violent. So there were negotiations over trying to get the Taliban to hand over Osama bin Laden and other Al-Qaeda members, and I think there's no way to know, but I think there's a possibility that had those negotiations been pursued a bit longer and with a bit more vigor, they might actually have produced a result. But I think that perhaps for a lot of people, that result of receiving Osama bin Laden, possibly putting him on trial, was not satisfactory. That it really had to be some kind of a violent response, and the thinking behind that is perhaps along the lines of what you just characterized as dick waving. That Bush, the U.S., had to be seen to be responding in a tough way, a military way. That this was not going to be a law enforcement action. That said, I think that there was enough time that possibly the negotiation approach might have prevailed if there had been enough people pushing for it. So I don't know that it was necessarily inevitable, but I do think that a very strong dynamic came into play that was difficult to unravel at that point, but that does resemble in a lot of ways what you're describing was going on between different gangs in your neighborhood.
So before we talk about the deep history, the deep roots theory of war, I do want to, one other thing that I saw within the Pinker-Horgan argument that went across blogs, one fellow, I forget who, had made an interesting comment that I think is rarely touched upon when talking about war. He said that even if you could show that humans were not warring 10,000 or so years ago between themselves, there is what looks to a naked eye, an alien eye, like a human war against all other animals. And he was talking, I think, about, for example, Native American ancestors when they came into the New World and they wiped out all the ancient megafauna, the woolly mammoths, the mastodons, all these huge animals. And I wonder, would that be considered war? Because, I mean, a lot of it was wasteful. It wasn't just for resources, unlike the noble savage myths. These humans were just as wasteful as the European or Asian or African counterparts. And I just wanted to toss that out. What do you think of that?
So that sounds, I mean, to me, closer to interpersonal violence, although, animals aren't people, but it sounds closer to interpersonal violence than it sounds to war. Just in the sense, I mean, we go back to the way I tried to characterize war earlier. I mean, I'm not sure exactly what would be the political incompatibility between humans and animals, and then also, the animals wouldn't have been very organized. I guess there would have been, perhaps certain animals could exhibit, some forms of organization. I mean, this would probably be a very good question to put to Richard Wrangham. But no, I guess I wouldn't characterize it as war, but it's perhaps in some ways similar to war in that it requires some of the same kinds of let's say tendencies or skills of the humans, including perhaps not worrying excessively about the pain that they're inflicting on other living creatures in order to carry out the violence, and just the actual skill in conducting the violence.
Michael, I'd like to talk a little bit about what the deep roots of war theory actually is. And do you know who came up with it, or is it just something that sort of formed out of the mists of internet arguing?
I do not know who might be considered the originator of this. I think that it. Just thinking, I suppose it has pretty deep roots. Mm-hmm. So. And we just talk a little bit about what it is. I think basically what it means, so far as I can tell, is that humans going back some thousands of years to back when they were hunter-gatherers were already warlike. So somehow war is, I guess some people might say that it comes naturally to humans, and that it wasn't something that was learned or developed much later in human existence. So if we think about the roots, then well, it's got to go back, at least to Hobbes, but I think earlier than that, surely. So Hobbes had this idea of a state of nature as a war of all against all, and the idea that then the Leviathan state, or the powerful state, imposes order, and then humans are no longer constantly at each other's throats. Of course, they'll sometimes be at each other's throats, but I think in Hobbes's view that that was kind of the natural state of affairs until you had a big state to overrule that. So I think it's been going on. It can be traced back a very long time.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, and then again, without having researched the whole history of this, Hobbes in this discussion is usually contrasted with Rousseau,
yeah,
who seems to have more of a view that humans in some mythical state of nature would be very peaceful, and that it's somehow this violence is somehow a learned characteristic that came with human culture and human history, and was kind of foisted onto the natural state of things. I think that's the broad contrast. And I'm sure that we can find earlier roots, but it seems to be distilled pretty well in Hobbes and Rousseau.
Well, the main opponent of this theory, it seems to be like 9 out of 10 posts against the deep roots theory, is by John Horgan, a science writer and journalist, who even seems to use stuff that seemingly supports the deep roots of war theory as disproof. And I know he wrote a book some years ago, back I think in 04, 05, called The End of Science, which was clearly in the same vein as Fukuyama's End of History book. And so what is your opinion of him generally, and also of his opposition to this theory? Because when we get talking a little further, to me it seems so obvious that there is, if not a wiring for war, an easy propensity for war in humans. Why do you think someone like Horgan is so against this idea?
Yeah, so I don't want to offer a full-blown view on John Horgan, since I don't feel that I'm familiar enough with a big enough swath of his work to render such a view. But what I will say is that I think where he's coming from on this is that he seems to think that it's dangerous to view war as I've used the word natural now, so I'll keep using it as kind of a natural state of affairs. That if we go way back to the hunter-gatherers, that somehow they already have in them a tendency toward violence and at least warlike behavior with each other, and the reason he thinks that, at least based on, you seem to have read a lot more of these blog posts than I have, but based on what I've seen, is that he thinks that this will lead to kind of to fatalistic attitudes, that people will say, why struggle against war? Because it's just nature. It's just natural. So that all of your efforts to prevent war, you're just trying to negate human nature. That's a fruitless task, and we might as well just accept our fate. So this is not my view, but I'm attributing this to Horgan based on what I've read. I think that's his biggest concern here, that kind of conceding a point that war kind of emerges naturally, or that violence emerges naturally, leads to fatalism.
Yeah, his argument seems to be against Pinker and Pinker's book that you mentioned, but the Better Angels. But it seems that Pinker is very clear within his book that just because we say that even if we are wired for war, that's not condoning it, since we have a society, we have made laws. I mean, if murderous impulses are within us and a natural part of us, then why would most societies have laws against murder?
Right. So yes. So I agree. The example I used in the one blog post myself that I wrote on this was sex. So like a drive to have sex is, I'm pretty confident, wired into humans. But that doesn't mean that inevitably, all women are going to have 15 kids, unless they develop some physical problem in their reproductive system, or that men, or all men, or large numbers of men will necessarily force themselves violently on women in an expression of this sex drive. It's something that I think is there, but it's not the only thing that's there. So we mentioned Pinker several times, and so I think Pinker's idea is that yes, the tendency for violence is very much hardwired in, and in addition, Pinker does take the view, which a lot of people dispute, but he takes the view that there was a lot of violence back when humans were hunter-gatherers. But I think that debate, which we could talk about a lot, but what I think, and you said it yourself a minute ago, what I think we should be able to agree on is, yeah, for sure the tendency is there, and maybe hunter-gatherer humans weren't as violent as Pinker thinks they were, but I think we can agree that we've all pretty much got within us this tendency toward violence, and under the wrong circumstances, it can be quite a dangerous, extraordinary thing. I mean, you were giving already your example, when you were out with your fellow gang members, and probably you were potentially much more dangerous than you were, when you were just walking around on your own. So, the group can, experience group dynamics that can lead to violence, but it's not hopeless. So that would be the point against Horgan. Even though those things are, I'm pretty confident, wired within us and potentially very dangerous, we can overcome them.
Mm-hmm. So
yeah, go ahead.
Let's go back to about 10,000 years ago, or even a little further. In the last 20 years, with DNA and genetic testing, certain groups have been said to have 2 to 3 to 4% of Neanderthal DNA within us. And that small percentage, to me, seems to argue for the fact that Homo sapiens wiped out Homo neanderthalis, because if this was a more pleasant merging of humans to form a new group, it would be closer to 50-50. The fact that there's only a small percentage of Neanderthal, and in some cases 0% within Homo sapiens, I think most Africans have next to none, because Neanderthals left Africa when they developed. That to me bespeaks that there had to have been a conquest and wiping out, and we took their women, we impregnated them, but with each succeeding generation, that percentage got smaller and smaller. So that to me argues for a violent human or Homo sapiens Neanderthal encounter, rather than a more blissful merging, doesn't it?
Um, yes, I mean, I, I, I think evidence is, of course, sparse. So that's one piece of evidence. But your interpretation, it makes a lot of sense. Um, um, I haven't thought about that before. I mean, I possibly if I spent some time thinking about it, I could come up with some other hypotheses that wouldn't necessarily suggest this kind of genocidal conclusion from it. But I mean that seems like a reasonable guess of what you would conclude from that evidence. Yeah.
And when we're talking about evidence, throughout the emails that were printed in the various blogs or whatnot, uh, a lot of the people that Horgan quotes are people who say, well, there's no evidence for mass graves or this or that 10,000, 12,000, 15,000, whatever years ago. But I mean, my response to that would be, well, now that we're closing in on 8 billion human beings, Homo sapiens, from what I've looked up, 10,000 or so years ago, estimates range from a high of 10 million to only 100,000 below, and most people say it's about a million Homo sapiens were on the planet 10,000 years ago. Well, you spread that out across the land area we have, that's one in what, 800 or 1 in 8,000, whatever it is. There just aren't going to be large phalanges of war there. You're not going to have Roman legions when you only have 1 million people. So if you're going to have that violence, you're only going to have a handful of people, and then it's going to have to be in an area that's going to desiccate the bones rather than in an acidic soil. So we get to the same thing when people talk about missing links. Well, there are no missing links. We are missing some transitional forms, but that doesn't mean invalidate evolution in the same way. Because there aren't mass graves 10,000 years ago, doesn't mean that there wasn't violence and small scale war. It just means they couldn't have been on a massive scale just by sheer numbers.
Yeah, I mean certainly that's true about the numbers. Could not have been on the scale that we saw later. I know there's a lot of debate about the grave sites that have been found. So and I have to say I have not gone through that debate minutely. So I don't have a really strong position on it. But I think that it would be safe to say that a lot of remains have been found with evidence of violent death. Some evidence could be argued in different ways, or there could be different interpretations. I mean, some people may have, let's say, fallen and fractured their skulls, and when we found the grave later, we interpret that as a homicide when perhaps it wasn't. When you get to the point where you're trying to estimate the percentage of people who were killed violently in that period, you've got problems. It may be, for example, that when there were mass for that period, relatively mass confrontations, which may be more like gang warfare or something than what we would see as war right now. But when there were mass confrontations and 10, 20 people are killed, maybe the practice was to bury those people together in a way that makes them relatively easy for us to find them later. But then, many people who died peacefully, were not maybe buried at all, or perhaps not. That the bodies were not placed in a way where we're likely to find them, and so we get a biased sample of all of the deaths that came during that period. So maybe it's overly bold to make these estimates of what percent are violent, but it does seem pretty clear from what I've seen that certainly violent death was well known, and did happen with some regularity, whatever the percentages are. Now, you could then go on to debate about whether that should be considered war in a technical sense or not, in a sense of groups battling over some kind of political issue. I mean, here it may well have been like when we do see evidence of big fights, that it may very well have been over some resources that they were struggling over, and you could call that a political incompatibility. So, but I just want to say it's a separate question about whether we're really talking about interpersonal violence, maybe shading into gang-like violence, or whether we should consider this war in some technical sense.
You had mentioned Rousseau, and I'd earlier mentioned the noble savage. Do you think that a lot of the people and the arguments around this deep roots war theory come down to political correctness, or this idea of the noble savage? Because I've always found that a lot of people who, whenever they talk about non-Western, non-white cultures, they go overboard in trying to ascribe good characteristics to them. Like I mentioned, Native American ancestors, there's plenty of evidence about wasteful kills. There's plenty of evidence that in Mesoamerican societies caused a lot of droughts themselves because of the way they husbanded the land and whatnot. So we have this idea that, these ancient cultures have some kind of wisdom or this or that. This is why also a lot of people believe Egyptians couldn't have built the pyramids. They had to have UFOs come and do it. To what degree do you think that this debate about war works into the Rousseauvian narrative of noble savagery?
I think that's for sure one of the factors there. Yeah, because I do think that the general mindset of many of the proponents of this are they're reacting against the idea that things are getting better. So in particular here we have one example of at least Steven Pinker claiming, and I think he builds quite a good case for it, but claiming anyway that humans are getting less violent, and I think that, well, I think there are various factors going on here. One factor is exactly the one you mentioned, is it's kind of an it's maybe anti-modernity, but also, let's say, pro civilizations other than the one that you and I are living in here, so that they don't want to say that something about earlier civilizations were worse. I think another factor is that when you say that things are getting better, a lot of people hear that as saying that things are now perfect or as good as they can get. We don't need to worry about our problems. I think there's kind of a mindset that a lot of people, intellectuals in particular, like to put forward is, I'm very concerned about the problems that we face. Well, I'm actually personally very concerned about the problems that we face, but I would not take the further step to say, to just refuse to say that, well, actually, some things have gotten better. So I'm concerned that too many mothers are dying in childbirth, and I would like to see us do as much as we possibly can to reduce maternal mortality. Now, it happens to be the case that maternal mortality rates have plummeted dramatically in recent decades. And I think it should be fair game to say that and to say, but of course, we still need to address the problem. Still far too many mothers are dying in childbirth, and we need to address that problem. But a lot of people just seem to really gag on that step, to say that, look, if maternal mortality is a problem and we need to reduce it, it's very important not to say that it's a lot better than it was 2 decades ago. So, and then you can take that back. You can take that back, 10,000 years. And, there's far too much violence in the world today, so why would you say that, there's actually, there may be less violence than there was a long time ago. I switched, by the way, I started to say there's actually less violence than there was 10,000 years ago, and I switched to maybe, because actually I'm not sure about that. I just spent a fair amount of time saying that we may be getting biased samples of graveyards. I think it's hard to estimate the percentage of the population killed violently 10,000 years ago.
Well,
so
I
I wouldn't rule out the possibility that it was actually not all that high, even though I am very convinced that there was plenty of violence.
Well, I mean, they wouldn't necessarily be conflicting, because if you have a much 1/8,000th the population you do today, the groups are going to be farther apart by necessity. So you're going to have less interactions. Those interactions may be as bloody when they come, but they're going to be less since there are less people involved and they're farther apart and they're going to have less interaction. So to me, that doesn't argue against it one way or the other. That's just the consequence of population.
Yeah, so that's a very interesting point. Yeah, let's talk about that a little bit. So if you imagine, just for the sake of argument, that let's say at each moment in time, combination of, let's say, biological, cultural factors kind of leave humans with a certain propensity for violence. And so I think what you're saying is that, perhaps 10,000 years ago, that propensity of violence was really quite high, maybe the highest ever, but anyway, very high propensity for violence. But since the globe was so sparsely populated, it doesn't express itself that much. So if we were able to measure percentage of the population back then killed in violent ways, it might be, maybe not low, but kind of lowish, and lower than a lot of subsequent periods when there might have been lower propensities for violence, but higher population density, so that people were crashing into each other much more, and so there were just a lot more opportunities for violence. I never heard that idea before, but that seems like that's a very interesting, plausible idea. I don't see any realistic way to really test it, in any hugely rigorous way. But it does seem like it's a serious thought here.
Well, let me go back to the counter arguments against it, and not the counter argument that is arguing that the deep roots don't exist, but there are other people that would argue that there was this saying back 50, 60 years ago that human beings are the only animals on the planet that war against themselves, and that's simply not true, because we know now war seems to be an intellectualized sort of violence, in that if you have social insects ants colonies war against each other. Ants war against termites. Bee colonies will war against each other and kill each other off. You have apes. Certainly the chimps are violent little bastards. Not the bonobos, but I think it's paniscus, the main chimps.
Right.
You certainly have whales. Packs of killer whales have warred against each other. Dolphins are not only they're good towards humans mostly, but dolphins hate porpoises. They will torture and kill whole packs or whatever they call them, and so you have this whole thing. And do we define that as war within animal kingdoms, or is that just gang violence? But the point is I think we for a long time wanted to say we're the most violent, the most this, the most that, saying that we're somehow exceptional in our violence, when it seems that we're just on a spectrum here.
Yes. And hopefully you'll be asking Richard Wrangham that. But yeah, certainly. I mean, I can remember people telling me this, that humans are the only ones who kill their own species. Yeah. We know that's not true. And it does seem that there's widespread wiring for committing violence, including violence against your own, within the animal kingdom. And you already said it yourself that you probably would have trouble convincing me that violence is war, just because I'm kind of wedded to this idea of organized group violence with the political incompatibility. But maybe I'm just being a little bit pedantic about it here. But it's not. It goes beyond just individual violence in the animal kingdom. That's for sure.
So, if we are to believe those who are like Horgan don't believe in this idea of the deep roots of war, what would be the cultural spur that 8,000-10,000 years ago, whenever you want to peg it, what would have been the cultural spur for human beings who were, let's say, more noble, savage-like, to suddenly become warlike? Because listening to their argument, if we don't if we don't know about this sort of spectrum, as I just said, in the animal kingdom of violence, and it seeming to be amongst higher the smarter species and smarter super organisms like ants and bees. Is it population density? Is it the advent of religion? Is it the advent of agriculture and trading of goods that caused it? And how would that then all of a sudden make people from being these peaceful fawn-like things into the savage?
Boy, that's a challenge. I really wondered what John Horgan and some others would say about this. I mean, you came up with some reasonable, although I don't find any of them convincing, but some reasonable suggestions, I mean, I guess if I were forced to make this case, I think I would try something along the lines of, saying that, way back when it was, relatively easy to just survive, from the bounty of nature, and that, as there was more population pressure, then stealing from others, started to look like more of a viable option. But I don't really buy it. I mean, I don't think it's actually that easy to survive out there. Like if you were to, plop me down naked in, a jungle somewhere, I mean, I think I'd probably just die. I mean, obviously I wouldn't have the advantages of, having parents to teach me how to do it. But, I just think that it was always hard work to scratch out in existence, as a hunter-gatherer. And I think the idea would have always been like fairly obvious. Like if you stumble onto some other crew that happens to have a fresh kill,
Yeah.
and of course you see animals doing this. Why not steal from that guy? And then, but then they're going to defend themselves.
Yeah.
I don't know what it would be.
Well, let me just ask this then. I mentioned agriculture. One of the things that agriculture did, it allowed for hunter-gatherers to become specialists rather than generalists. And when we had specialists, people who could make the clay pots, people who were experts in farming, people who were experts in whatever religion or culture that they had, people who were, that allowed for us to have this specialty called warriors. To defend, the little girls who can't defend themselves. We have a warrior class. So do you think that maybe one of the arguments might be that civilization itself necessitates specialism, which then necessitates a warrior class?
So what I think actually happened when we got agriculture and specialism, warrior classes. I mean, I think that's all accurate. But I think more likely violence went down at that point because previously, like when everyone was a hunter-gatherer, I think that they probably had to be prepared to. Everyone had to be prepared to defend themselves if necessary, but then eventually you get like just a group of people. It's just a relatively small subgroup, of the whole society that are responsible for the war. So on the one hand, they're probably better at it than people for which being able to defend yourself is just one amongst many characteristic. But still, and it kind of gets back to one of the points you made earlier. Still, they're a small fraction. The warrior class is a small fraction now of all humans, and most of the time they'll be fighting against each other. Now, of course, if your warrior class is completely wiped out, it could result in, like now, your whole village or society getting wiped out. It's not necessarily that you have only professional soldiers fighting professional soldiers, but still, I think that if anything, there was less violence when that started to happen. Of course, that sets in train, though, like a whole series of developments. Now that you have people who are devoting their lives to only this, they're going to start making technological innovations. They'll start figuring out better ways to kill other groups.
Well, let me just ask you this, Michael, because I spent many years in corporate America, and one of the things that I've seen in corporations is individual departments look out for themselves rather than the whole corporation. For example, if I'm in retail and I'm a buyer and my salary depends on me bringing in a lot of stuff, even if it doesn't sell, if my salary depends upon me bringing a lot of crap that isn't going to sell, I'm going to bring in a lot of crap that isn't going to sell, even if it's bad overall for the company and it might lose money. So let's say if we specialize, the farmers are going to look out for the farmers and the warriors are going to look out for the warriors. And for a warrior to look out, there has to be war. There has to be an enemy. So I think that would be something that the Horgans would say. If you have a warrior class, they will always find an enemy.
Yeah. Well, I think there's much to that. So yes. So that might go against my claim or speculation that maybe violence would be reduced once we get these specialized warriors. Is that now you've got it's sure it's just a fraction of the population. And actually, now that I think about it, what I was thinking about violence being reduced is something like violent deaths as a percentage of let's say, world population or all humans. So population is growing throughout history, and so the number of violent deaths is going to tend to creep up because there are just more and more people around who can do the killing and can be killed. But what I was thinking was that violent deaths as a percentage of the total population would go down because only a fraction are engaged in war. And then I think you're coming back and you're saying, yes, but these people now they're gonna think really seriously about war, and if there isn't a war, they're gonna have reasons to try to make sure there is one, because otherwise, what use are they?
Yeah.
Or even like, what have they been training for? And I think that's a real dynamic, could push the other way. I don't see here any kind of like monotonic or steady trend, downwards, upwards. I think violence has gone up and down over the centuries. Even violence as a percentage of global population. What I do think is that there's been a substantial decline in violence since World War II. Okay, so we've suddenly fast forwarded, 10,000 years or more. So there could be, I think there were factors pushing and pulling in different directions. It's hard enough building reliable data going back a couple of centuries. I think, we don't really know, with any degree of certainty how much violence there was, 10,000, 8,000, 6,000 years ago. It's interesting to think through the factors and speculate about it, but at the end, there's not going to be really a hard answer to that question.
So let's just start wrapping up here. Is there any point that you wanted to make that we haven't touched upon yet, that maybe you wanted to add an addendum to your blog post?
Well, one thing, because Pinker's come up a few times, so let me talk a little bit about Steven Pinker and his Better Angels book. A common misinterpretation of Pinker's views on war that I kind of see all over the place is that Pinker says that war has been in decline for centuries. If you look at it carefully, what you see is that, so the book has a very wide scope. It's really about pretty much every possible form of violence you can think of, including spanking of children, vegetarianism, versus killing and eating animals, homicide. A lot of it is interpersonal violence. In fact, I would say the majority of the book is about interpersonal violence. But the chapters that are specifically on war really just make the case that there has been a decline in war violence since the end of World War II. This gets mixed up because he talks a lot about hunter-gatherers, and he takes the view that hunter-gatherers were actually super violent. He does talk about many wars, going back, some centuries. He talks about Mongol invasions and, makes the point that, the Mongols, killed a very high percentage of the world population at the time, so that, their violence is comparable to some of the worst 20th century violence we've seen. So a lot of that, as it affects war, is just saying that you shouldn't think that super violent war is a 20th century invention. That there were a lot of extremely violent wars going back a number of centuries. But really, the case for the decline of war specifically, rather than violence more generally, and in particular interpersonal violence, is really about the post-World War II period. His first chapter on war is entitled "The Long Peace," which is taken from a classic article by Cold War historian John Gaddis, who wrote, I believe, in 1986, an article just saying, gee whiz, the Cold War has been on now for 4 decades, and we haven't seen a major war between great powers. Kind of amazing considering how much tension there's been in previous centuries. That kind of tension would have led to a major war, but it didn't.
Well, mutually assured destruction, MAD.
Right. Well, that's one of the, and I think Gaddis would go with that as one of his key explanations. The threat of nuclear war is sometimes called the nuclear peace. That it kind of kept things in check. And long peace also is perhaps an unfortunate term, and he's quick to clarify that he doesn't mean that the world has been totally peaceful since 1946, but he's just saying there hasn't been a major clash between great powers, direct clash between great powers, and certainly the nuclear war has been avoided. So so Pinker names his chapter after that, and then he coins a new term, the new peace, to denote even further decreases in violence after Gaddis's article and when the Cold War ended. And I think that's really what that's about. And but numerous people, I see this. I'm writing an article that will include some survey of this literature right now. But numerous people, basically didn't seem to get that memo, and so there's this persistent idea that he's argued for centuries-long decline of war, which actually he hasn't.
Yeah. So, final question then, just to wrap it up. With global warming being maybe the #1 existential threat, I mean, I don't think even if it's worse, it's going to wipe humanity out, but it could cause wars that could cause a lot more damage, water wars, resource wars, etc. Do you think that, and I've often said that I think global warming, we need a world war response from all the major powers to invest to the same way we approach war, we need to approach saving the oceans, acidifying and stuff. But do you think that war is still the biggest existential threat, or is it global warming or climate change?
I would go with climate change.
Yeah.
Of course, as long as we've got nuclear weapons around, there's always the potential for a truly horrific war. So you can't just say that there is no existential threat there. There is, but I think that climate change is kind of the much more realistic and pressing crisis that needs to be addressed. Yeah.
Well, I want to thank you for spending an hour or so speaking with me. I will link to both your WordPress article on this topic as well as your university page. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. I really enjoyed myself, and be happy to talk to you again about anything.